All good parents want their children to do well. They give them help when they need it, and they try to see them through the tough times. Some are even overprotective, sheltering their kids from failure or disappointment. But for all the well-meaning support parents offer their kids, they may also be keeping them from learning a critical skill, how to bounce back, all on their own. Or, as our next guest might call it, resilience. Joining us now to explain, Michael Unger. He's a professor of social work and director of the Resilience Research Center. It's at Dalhousie University, and he's the author of I Still Love You, 9 Things Troubled Kids Need from Their Parents. And we're delighted to welcome you to our studio here at TVO.
Great to be here.
Why so much concern these days in particular about kids' resilience?
I think what you're seeing is just perhaps this overprotective parenting trend that we're beginning to see a spike in anxiety disorders amongst our children. There's a lot of consciousness now about children who are refugees, who are children who are displaced. I guess we've maybe reached that critical point where we realize we can actually do better, that there's actually something that we can do to help kids get through these kinds of crises, and that this overcompensation, this overprotective trend is actually denying kids the very things that they need to do well. So it's kind of for me, it's going both directions. It's when we know there's a bunch of vulnerable kids that we can actually help and avoid the trauma. And there's another group, perhaps, that we're really worried about that, frankly, we're overprotecting and maybe making more vulnerable by trying to help them.
It's so ironic, though, that in our efforts to do better by our kids, we may actually be harming them. I mean, that's the last thing any parent wants to hear.
Yeah, and
there you go.
That's exactly it. And I think what we need to do is shift the conversation from being so protective to maybe thinking about the risk taker's advantage, that there is some advantage to kids, psychosocial development. They're all the building blocks that they need to become good, competent adults, able to cope with life's challenges. And that part of that is exposing them to manageable amounts of risk and responsibility when they're younger. Now, that's, of course, for kids that do have the supports to get through. If the kid's living, a child's living in incredible, stress, or has just had a terrible loss in their life, you don't want to overburden them. You do want to protect them. So, unfortunately, this is a game of finding a balance as a parent or as an educator. How much risk is this child under? What do they actually need to be resilient in that particular setting?
Just as nature and nurture are very similar words but mean different things, I'm going to give you 2 words and I want you to tell me the difference between the two. Resiliency and resilience.
Yeah. Well, if I took you back 40 or 50 years ago when these ideas were really launching, they talked about resiliency, and what they meant was an inner trait. It was this kind of notion that I bounce back because of something inside of me. More recently, though, the field has really said, the science doesn't bear that out. What we actually see is resilience, which is what we help our kids to find the resources. We make it possible for them to grow and thrive. I mean, the example I often give is we kind of do what fairy godmothers or fairy godfathers do in the Cinderella story. Cinderella wasn't like resilient on her own. She had someone helping her. So her resilience, her ability to sort of shine through was because there was an environment around her, people, in the case of fairy godmother, that actually made her success possible.
But presumably there are some children who are naturally more resilient than others.
Actually, that's absolutely true. There's a small percentage of children who have the right personality in the right context. But the interesting thing about this, and I do research, our center does research literally on a global scale. Just in Portugal, South Africa, we have projects. We have in the high Arctic of Canada, all over the globe we work. And it's interesting, what traits really matter to a child will always be determined by the culture and the context in which they're in. So if you're living in downtown Toronto, a certain, capacity to sort of navigate your subway systems and get on a bus and be outdoors and deal with the noise and congestion of a city is important. But, if you're in maybe the high Arctic of Canada, you're looking at a whole different cultural set of practices. You're looking at different skill sets that are going to actually be a certain kind of personality type is likely to be much more fitting in that particular context.
As a parent, can you teach resiliency?
Oh, absolutely. You can, well, in a sense, what you can do is give your child opportunities to develop.
Because maybe I'm making too much of this, but it seems to me there's a distinction between creating the opportunity for resiliency and actually sort of pedagogically teaching them how to do it.
You can, if your child is reasonably safe, lots of resources, so you would not say that your child's terribly at risk. And you can teach them how to self-regulate, mindfulness practices, having a positive mindset, or a positive set of ideas in your head that says, I can do it, I can get through this, this was a crisis, all that kind of stuff that we can actually teach kids to get out of the negative thinking. Absolutely. But what our research shows, and what my clinical practice shows, is as a child's exposed to more danger, more risk, that mindset also has to be met by things like, do I provide my child with the right amount of structure and some consequences? Have they a bunch of relationships around them? So if a grandparent has just passed away, is there other family members who are going to maybe fill that void? If they're a recent immigrant and they've lost a lot of connections to their culture back home, is there some sort of maybe a religious institution or a social network or something that's going to connect them back to their culture? Positive mindset is going to help them to take advantage of those opportunities. But it's not enough on its own unless we also make sure that we're providing all these other things that make it possible for those kids to shine.
But I guess it starts with us as the parents. And let's do an even simpler example. Monkey bars, right? Parents have got to let their kids play in the monkey bars. And
when I started doing some of this research, I remember vividly watching it was a mom, could have been a dad, very anxious about watching her 4-year-old climb too high in the monkey bars where she couldn't reach her. And the child picked up on that panic and as a consequence sort of froze up there, and then the mom had to sort of cajole the child down and everything else. But if you think about it, if we give our 4-year-olds the message that climbing on monkey bars are dangerous, then we're, in a sense, maybe not doing our job, which is helping the child to problem solve the monkey bars. The message shouldn't be, oh, you're too high, you're going to fall. The message should be, where are your hands? Can you back down? Where do you want me, your support system? Do you want me under you, which I'd really like to be, or do you want me over here, which I don't want to be? But there's a whole bunch
but fun.
Risky but fun. And in fact, we're seeing this notion of smart risk. And we're seeing that also genuine responsibilities as well. Enough of this, kids should have something. As we move into the holiday seasons and stuff, and people are you going to get your kids to actually make a contribution to the family, or is it just going to be a give kind of thing? That's the kind of dynamic we want to see.
We're talking about parents so far, but I wonder whether the public education system has a role in teaching resiliency as well.
Well, absolutely. They have a teacher in terms of setting up the classrooms and the school system so that kids have these opportunities to get what they need. And schools can be, just like parents, schools can give kids a really powerful identity, a sense of control, some decision making. They can push kids into new relationships. A very, very simple example of a child who was really feeling awkward, shy, socially withdrawn, a little bit bullied. And what he'd done was, he was all of 10 years old, and what he'd done was he had made a connection with the janitor at the school. And he found in the shadow of the janitor that he was safe, right? He didn't get jostled in the hallways, and he had a place to go at recess and everything else. The funny part of the story was that eventually this janitor, who's a real, salt of the earth kind of guy, says to this kid, well, look, if you're always around me, you better just pick up a broom and give me a hand. Now, that's kind of funny in one way, but it also meant that the kid suddenly had a place, a purpose in the school. And the other kids began to see him as kind of like, okay, you have a role here. And in fact, when they'd walk on the floor that he just mopped or swept, this kid, they would sort of, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm walking on your floor. And suddenly this kid felt like, the way I sort of see it is this kid
got some stature
yeah,
now.
he's got something to be proud of, and he's got relationships. The schools are so often the place where we can create powerful identities just like a family can as well.
Now, conversely, on the other side, I've heard you talk about the little thief story. You want to tell that story?
Well, the little thief. I mean, I met a 6-year-old little girl that was brought to me by her mom, and the story was, the mom said, fix the little thief, if you can believe it. I mean, what a thing, poor little thing.
She described her little kid as the little thief.
Mom was pretty stressed because this little girl, grade 1, new to the community, had figured out that to make friends, nobody had noticed her, so to make friends, what she had done was sneak off the playground at lunchtime, go across to a store, fill up a little brown paper bag of little gummy bears and all those kinds of treats, and then managed to sneak out of the store, stealing the candy, and bring it back to the playground and give it out. And that was her way of making friends. So when we intervened, both as a mental health team and as a school team, what we did was we made her important in the school so she wouldn't have to make friends by stealing. And we gave her an opportunity, though she was in grade 1, she wasn't a great student, but heck, we gave her an opportunity to go down to the JK, the junior kindergarten, and work as a little teacher, as a junior teacher. And of course for her, it was like, again, that status, I'm important, I belong here, everything was great. But what it did was it changed her relationship to her peers. It gave her a powerful identity. It made her feel like she belonged at school. And then we began to work on the mother-daughter relationship because mom was kind of so busy and so new to the community and working so hard that she wasn't paying enough attention to her daughter. And once that was pointed out, between what happened at school and what happened at home, it was an easy fix.
This quest for status really sounds like it's at the foundation of a lot of this stuff. And now the solution she picked was obviously the wrong solution. Yes. But that, we got to be aware of that, don't we?
Yeah, I think when you think of it as almost like I sometimes describe it like a Cirque du Soleil act where I'm juggling all these things in the air, but amongst those things you're juggling as a parent or as a school is, are you providing structure and natural consequences that make sense to the kid? Are you providing relationships both to you but also to others? Because we can't do this alone. And are you giving a kid a powerful identity, some control, a sense of belonging, safety, supports, responsibilities? When you start pushing all that stuff together, which is actually what I talk about in I Still Love You, the book, but when you push it all together, you're just buffering, you're making it possible for that child next time they hit a speed bump in life, right? Somebody bullies them, they fail at something, or God forbid somebody dies in their family or something tragedy or divorce or something. If they have all that working for them, the research is clear. They will go through that crisis, they will dip in their development, they will slide a little bit, but they will come back because they have so many of those supports, an internal sense that I can change my world. These are the foundation stones for a child that will be successful.
Let me pick up on that example. If a child does undergo a significant trauma, like God forbid the death of a parent or a sibling or something like that, what is the typical type of behavior generally demonstrated in the immediate aftermath?
So what you'll see is, as a parent, what you're going to see is mostly a change. So obviously if you have a child that's already outrageously in their behavior and screaming and resistant and says no, no, no to everything, you might see a socially withdrawn or shy or quiet child. And the opposite will happen is a quiet child may become, through that traumatic experience, much more, all of a sudden, very resisting, very angry, not willing to go to bed, those kinds of things. You'll see changes in eating habits, play habits, friends. You'll see behavioral problems, lack of attention. Bedtime routines will be shifted. When you start seeing dramatic shifts, it's usually a sign that the child is under significant stress. Now, obviously, if it's severe, you should get professional help. Hopefully, people will have a place that they can reach out. But there are things that you can do to stabilize that situation.
Go ahead. Like
such as, make sure that there are routines. After natural disasters, one of the things that we know helps is getting kids back to school and into their peer groups as fast as possible. We also know from kids that are under major stress that if you make sure there's some sort of cultural continuity, the sense that they're still part of a community, there's still a sense of values that before and after, that they're the same person somehow, that they're treated fairly, that they're because often, say after a divorce, the biggest trauma for kids is often that they change houses, they change communities, and that's what we think it's always the loss of the parent. But actually, what often, that stings the child, but you'd be surprised at how many children will actually say, no, it's the fact that I had to change schools, I had to change homes, I had to change friends. It's that compounded effect.
So losing their whole foundation.
It's losing your foundation, but it's because it's those relationships, the way people know me, maybe that school I played on a sports team, or I was a part of a club or something like that. When you begin to fracture so many of those relationships, those hobbies, those interests, those identities, those experiences of power and control, which of course when someone passes away or divorce happens, as a child you experience that as a threat to your control. These are the things that actually potentially traumatize children. And of course we can fix those as adults.
In those moments when a parent is trying to inculcate skills of resiliency after something traumatic happens, I guess there's a sweet spot to find between being too much in the kid's face and trying to be with them every second of the day and just kind of avoiding them altogether and letting them find their own way. Do you know how we find that sweet spot?
Well, first of all, don't try and be the child's friend. They don't need a friend.
They still need a parent.
They need a parent.
Yeah.
They need someone who's going to provide the structure, the reasonable consequences, and who the child can, in a sense, sometimes parents will say, my child is an absolute, and they, whatever word you want to finish that sentence with. But then they'll be out in a public situation like the mall, and they'll meet a neighbor, and the child is actually darling, or a teacher, and you kind of go, is this my same kid? But I think we need to realize that, in a sense, a child who's well bonded to us as a parent will actually push back because we're safe. We're the ones that they can express it to. And I think parents intuitively know that. But the point is, we help a child by maintaining the continuity. We are the stable one. We're the ones that reminds the child that you have something special to be. We have expectations of you to be something better.
That's a very interesting take on bad behavior, that somehow they feel powerful enough to demonstrate it to you because they feel closest to you and they know you can handle it.
Isn't that awful as a parent that we get that?
That is a simple, well, that's an interesting interpretation, but what a shame
Well,
in
often,
some respects.
sometimes that bad behavior, I write quite often that there's this pattern of what's called hidden resilience, which is a term I've used to basically say, look, sometimes a pattern of behavior is the best a child can do to cope in a situation that's bad. So even a child who becomes socially withdrawn or anxious may be using those sets of behaviors as a way of coping with a threatening environment. If you remove the threat of the environment, there's no more bullies at school, or they are succeeding because they get a tutor, or something like that, quite often the behavior sort of melts away as well because the environment around them changes and they can find a different adaptive way of coping. I know it's odd to say sometimes those behaviors that are troubling are actually a sign of resilience, but again, for me, the question is, resilience isn't static. It's not like child is resilient or not resilient. I always say, tell me the risk factors, tell me the environment, tell me how the behavior gives the child an opportunity to have some routines, feel connected, like themselves more, and if they're finding that through a bad behavior, if it's storming out of the house or running away or whatever, you're still, you're talking about, are those bad behaviors getting them what they need? And then our job as parents, find a substitute, give them another path to get those same needs met in a more socially desirable, family-oriented, positive way, and often children accept our invitation.
Does your research indicate whether this is a bigger problem, the issue of resiliency, among boys versus girls, or urban versus rural kids, or kids who live in hot climates all the time versus colder climates, any of that kind of stuff?
What we see, what we'll see is different patterns of resilience, boys and girls. So as much as we say we like to treat our children equal and we like to create equal opportunities, that's not the real world. And so girls will probably, what we see in our research, sometimes girls will express their resilience in different ways. One very interesting thing we found, though, is that when we studied resilience in boys and girls around the world, I'm talking like 14 countries, 5 continents, a girl in a school in Tanzania had more in common with a girl in downtown Halifax than those girls had with the boys sitting next to them.
Interesting.
And we kind of figured that because the girls had this universal experience of being, pushed aside, treated lesser, the sexism that's inherent in many of our cultures and societies, that they could actually share the things that they needed to be more resilient, a certain robustness, a certain capacity to talk back, a certain sense of identity, all these things, they shared that even though they lived literally half a world away, while the boys next to them showed a lot more differences across countries.
That is fascinating.
It's the kind of stuff that gets you back into thinking, think about what your kid actually needs in that particular moment, in that particular community. What would they feel good about learning from you? To ride the bus or to have an outdoor experience during the summer, or go, what is it that they need that's going to build for them where you live the building blocks of knowing I'm powerful, I have decision-making power, I feel connected to others, and I'm being treated fairly.
Just kind of reminds me that we adults still have a hell of a lot of work to do, don't we?
The nice thing, yeah, and I'm optimistic, though. I'm optimistic.
Good. That's Michael Unger. He's a professor in the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University, also a Canada Research Chair in Child, Family, and Community Resilience. And we're glad you spared some time for us at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Total pleasure to be here.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.